the selection committee for the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence selected unanimously Victor Navasky to win the medal this year. So I think he deserves a hand right now, don't you? Victor, this medal is in recognition of your career, which is dedicated to journalistic integrity, and for your work speaking truth to power beyond the confines of mainstream media and journalism. The I.F. Stone Award, for those of you who may not know, and in case you haven't read the foundation website, was established in 2008, administered obviously by the Nieman Foundation, and the I.F. Stone Medal honors the life of the investigative journalist I.F. Stone and is presented annually to a journalist whose work captures the spirit of journalistic independence, integrity, and courage that characterized I.F. Stone's Weekly, which was published from 1953 to 1971. I know there are a number of very young people here compared to I.F. Stone or the time that he was publishing in the audience, and so you may not be familiar with his work, but he is considered an icon for independent journalists. His I.F. Stone Weekly he circulated it himself. It was a weekly. He had investigative reporting and more than investigative reporting, and Victor's going to comment on that a little bit. He was able to tie together history. He was able to tie together all kinds of things so that he could put much of what he found, and often in the record. He would look at the congressional record. He looked at documents. He was a documents reporter, although he did also, do regular reporting. But his genius was being able to find stories that became newsbreaking that were actually in the documents that most of the journalists had not had time to read. He considered that his job, reading what a lot of journalists at the time felt were boring government records. And so he broke stories like he had one aspect of the Vietnam War. He predicted the Holocaust. He repeatedly broke stories and was a must-read publication when he was publishing it. So as it turns out, Victor had we did not know this at the time until after we selected him, when Myra told us, had a close personal relationship with I.F. Stone. Myra, we wished she could be here. Myra McPherson is his autobiographer, and she was unable to be here. But Myra probably knows more about I.F. Stone than, I don't know, maybe Celia, right? Or maybe Victor. So as it turns out, she told us that he had a close personal relationship and was inspired and guided by I.F. Stone's example. Victor shares actually many of the qualities that Stone's journalism and his character embodied. They include courage, independence, and integrity. And also, as Myra pointed out, and I've experienced when I was on a fellowship at the same time as you, a satirical wit. And I think you're going to hear a little bit of that in just a few minutes. Victor has served as editor, publisher, and now publisher emeritus of The Nation magazine, which was founded at the end of the Civil War, 1865, correct, Victor?
Yes.
And remains the oldest continually published weekly in the United States. In 1994, when the magazine's survival was seriously threatened, Victor moved from editor to publisher. And I remember you're talking about this, what am I going to do? Because the main funder had decided not to continue to fund the magazine. And Victor, who I think did not have a business background, fairly quickly turned it around. And so that the magazine today is on, well, as Victor said, it doesn't make a profit, but it's on break even, solid feet. What shall we say? Yes. It's still publishing. Victor has a very distinguished career. He is currently Professor Emeritus at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, where he directed the Delacorte Center for Magazines, and he continues to serve on CJR's board of directors. During the 1970s, Victor served as an editor for the New York Times Magazine. In the 1960s, he was founding editor and publisher of the political satire magazine, here comes the humor, Monocle. His career spanned several political eras during which he perfected his own brand. You know, he's not a copycat of I.F. Stone, but his own brand of entrepreneurial, independent, non-traditional, and courageous truth-telling. Some of his important work published in some cases several decades ago, including his coverage of McCarthyism, resonates today with all who have the courage and want to have the courage to hold the powerful accountable. We won't get into the politics of today, but you know, you will. Many people think this is a time in which journalism, and especially investigative journalism, and especially independent investigative journalism, is seriously threatened, not just by financial forces, but also by political forces. Victor, I'm going to tell a little bit more about your history, okay, so that everyone realizes even more about you. Victor's books include Kennedy Justice, an examination of Robert F. Kennedy's role as head of the U.S. Department of Justice. That might be relevant today. Naming Names, an analysis of the Hollywood blacklist, which won a National Book Award, and A Matter of Opinion, a reflection on his journalistic experiences, which won the 2005 George Polk Award and the 2008 Amin Sperber Prize. He's also, with Christopher Cerf, he wrote The Experts Speak, the definitive compendium, sorry about that, of authoritative misinformation, and then Mission Accomplished, or How We Won the War in Iraq. Really? He'll tell us more about that too. So Victor is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences. He served as a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation, a Guggenheim Fellow, a fellow at the Institute of Politics, right over across the way at the J.F. Kennedy School of Government, and a senior fellow at the Freedom Forum. And he was Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton. Now, the symbiotic relationship that they had between Victor and I.F. Stone was one of two great journalists, and it's reflected in a lifetime of work and dedication by Navasky to nonprofit. Well, yours was profit. Yeah, I remember you told me all the time. It's profit. It's not. Doesn't make a profit, but it's a profit-making organization. But doing the kind of investigative reporting and calling on powers that be when they've need to be called on, and his admiration of Stone propelled him into a lifetime dedication to the truth, while possessing the same outrage at injustice that Stone expressed. So in his best-selling book, A Matter of Opinion, which was winner of the Polk Award, is a combination of memoir and examination of journalism that combines the wit that Stone possessed and with in-depth knowledge of his craft. And here's a quote from a book review. "Here stands revealed the true Navasky, a man of steely purpose with a mischievous streak, a child's inability to leave pompousness unpricked, a moralist's dislike of complacency, a rat terrier's instinct for the ankle of received wisdom." And this is what Thomas Powers said in his review of the book. Do you remember this?
No.
His clever satirical monocle, this is again the quote by Powers, was a huge success with a handful of readers, and Navasky's passion to keep it going prepared him for the Sisyphean task of accepting responsibility for the nation. No general, no king, no pope, it may be said, ever accepted his duty more seriously or carried it out less solemnly, Powers wrote. At this time, when we know that fact-based reporting and journalism, you've heard about that, right? Is often under attack or is under attack by powerful political forces and ideologues who label investigative reporting as, you know the answer, right? Fake news. The committee felt that honoring Victor Navasky should serve as an important reminder that independent journalism that holds powerful institutions accountable is part of a long and necessary tradition in our democracy. We also felt that spotlighting Victor in these particular political times, and along with his connection to I.F. Stone, who is revered in the investigative journalism tradition, would not only honor Victor, but would also serve to inspire and motivate journalists of all ages when they when they hear about these two fantastic journalists and then go to learn more about them. So also, we felt that some of Victor's most important work would, especially about the dangerous days of McCarthyism, which many people don't even remember, those days were dangerous and frightening days that Victor and other independent journalists were committed to speaking truth to power. It wasn't easy then because it was scary, I would think, Victor. Is that correct?
Don't remember.
And we felt that Victor's career offered a reminder that the past really can become the future if we fall into complacency as journalists in particular. A reminder that you can't take progress for granted, and that if we stop to listen, history tells us that nothing is for sure, there are no guarantees, that progress is not always linear as we like to think, and that dedicated, brave, and non-traditional independent journalists are needed now more than ever. So, Victor, I'm honored to be able to present to you this beautiful I.F. Stone Medal for journalistic independence. Somebody wants to take a picture of you, so I suggest you turn around, right? So I'm going to put it right here. And now you get a real treat, being able to hear Victor talk about his relationship with I.F. Stone.
I'd rather hear you talk about me because I found it very embarrassing.
Well, I can say more, Victor.
Found it very embarrassing. Anyway, and I don't want to claim to be closer to Izzy than I was, and I'll say a little about that in a minute or two. But on your remarks, Florence, the one thing I'll say about The Nation is that when I came to The Nation, we kept it as a for-profit magazine, even though it had lost money for 120 years when I got there, because as a nonprofit, you're not allowed to endorse candidates for a political office, and we wanted to be able to endorse candidates without getting in any kind of trouble. And so we organized a circle of 100 people to put up a certain $5,000 a year for 3 years, but I told them when they did that, they would probably lose their money, and I promised them they would get their pro rata share of the tax deduction because we're organized as a limited partnership. And if the partnership loses money, you get your pro rata share. And then a year before I stopped, we made a little money, so I had to send a letter of apology because they had to pay $10 or $15 or whatever it was. So there's the story of The Nation. Now, as far as Izzy goes, I was not his close friend the way you describe it, but I did admire him as much as I admired anyone in the world and of journalism. I first met him In 1953, I was a student in something called the Washington semester, which students, that was the first year that that was in place. It was sponsored by American University. I went to Swarthmore College, and students from all over the country came to American University for one semester, and you were supposed to see how government worked, and you'd go to Congress, and you'd go to the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. But the high point of my time there was I went to the Library of Congress one day, and there, going through the card catalog in 1953, was I.F. Stone, whom I recognized from his goggle glasses and the earpiece, which he was famous for strategically turning on and off when he didn't want to hear what you had to say. And I introduced myself to him. I'd actually met him on Fire Island years before when I played ball on a porch, but I introduced myself to him, and he told me about this newsletter that he was going to start, this magazine newsletter, and which he did later in the year. So I got that advanced glimmer of it, and it was a great thing that I was to learn years later. And then I discovered a whole bunch of other things about him afterwards. I became a regular reader of his. I read him in PM, which was a radical newspaper at the time, a left-wing progressive newspaper owned by Marshall Field that he wrote for. And I also subsequently discovered that when I came to the Nation, that he had, and I knew that he had been Washington editor of the Nation. I didn't know why he stopped being Washington editor, but I subsequently found out that Frida Kirchway parted ways with him when he took an assignment from PM to go and was the first journalist to follow the Jewish underground before the State of Israel was in business. And he forgot to mention to Frida that he had agreed to do this for PM. And so they went their separate ways. And when I came to the Nation, I subsequently decided that one of my goals would be to try to bring Izzy back. So over the years, people would ask me if I had a role model. I didn't like that word, but I said if I had role models, he would be it. And the reason why, as I wrote in A Matter of Opinion, was best said by Murray Kempton, the great journalist himself. And Kempton wrote that on an average issue, I.F. Stone's Weekly is more illuminating than the average edition, Sunday edition of the Sunday New York Times. Yet I do not think such an argument really renders I.F. Stone his due. The special qualities of Mr. Stone's work are larger than those we expect, even in the best journalism. He is employed in the higher criticism. He travels alone, and he is in no way alienated. His spirit is absolutely open. His method is monastic. He has kept intact the strongest opinions without developing the smallest visible prejudice. He is a romantic and untempted by whatever particular romance happens to be fashionable. So when I returned from Washington after my Washington semester, I heard Izzy give an inspiring speech. Jeremy, his son, was a student, and he was a freshman, and I was a senior, and Izzy was invited to speak. And he explained how he always refused to attend off-the-record briefings, and then he would scoop those who were at the off-the-record briefings, but were precluded by the ground rules from reporting what they had heard. Izzy would debrief them and then go and check out what they had been told, decide whether or not it was true, write about it. Many years later, after I came to the Nation, the literary agent Timothy Seldes told me he was having his uncle, the crusading foreign correspondent George Seldes, then in his 90s, to dinner. And Izzy and his wife were together coming up to New York from Washington, and would I join them? To me, this was the high point of my life up to that point, and I jumped at the chance, of course. I knew that Izzy had modeled his own newsletter after George Seldes' little publication called In Fact, and I told Timothy Seldes I wouldn't miss that dinner for anything. And so I went there, and despite his poor eyesight, which everyone knows about, Izzy saw things that no one else saw, and he missed, and others missed, even though it was in plain sight and Izzy saw it. So that night, Seldes was more of, you could tell, was more of an old-fashioned blunderbuss muckraker, while Izzy, whose project was to synthesize Jefferson and Marx, was more of an investigative reader, from my point of view, working from the public record. But they both operated outside the conventional system. They were guerrilla journalists. They were idealists whose weapons were facts. And in Izzy's case, his weapons included ideas as they showed themselves in the great forces and fundamental struggles that shaped our history. So after that dinner, we left the Seldes apartment in the 90s and were walking down. Izzy and Esther stayed at the Tudor Hotel, and they liked to stay there, which is in the 30s on the east side. And I walked Izzy down there, and Esther, and at that point, he told me he had an idea. By then, I was at The Nation. He told me he had an idea for The Nation. He thought it, because I told him I wanted him to come back and write for us. And he thought that it was appropriate to his energy level, this idea. He said every week he had at least one idea, and that what he would do would be each week to write 150 words, and we could run it under the heading called Izzy Says. Sounded great. So I called David Levine, the great caricaturist for New York Review of Books. He did a brilliant caricature of Izzy holding a pen like a medieval knight would hold a spear by his side. And we commissioned the illustration to go with the Izzy Says paragraph. And sure enough, a week later, 150 words arrived from Izzy. Beautiful 150 words on the Reagan Defense Department. And they came in, I thanked Izzy, and we set it up, had planned to publish it that week. And the layout person laid it out with the great caricature and pen. And then about a day later, Izzy called and said, listen, this story is bigger than I thought it was. I went down and checked the wire services, and this story is too important not to include that. So I got another 200 words I would like to send in. So the copy department said, okay. The layout artist had to throw out the layout and put in a new layout, and the thing was scheduled to go to press a day and a half later. And then the next day, Izzy called again. And he said, listen, I think we have a real scoop here. This is huge. And he had 200 more words. So, but nevertheless, we went ahead and we published the paragraph. And all of the young people in the office who didn't realize the great privilege they had working with I.F. Stone, they hadn't heard of him before, grumbled about having to deal with an author who kept changing his story. And we ran it, and it made some news. The following week, he sent another 150 words, and the same thing happened. He called again, and he had more, and the week after that, he sent another 150 words, and the same thing happened again. At which point, all these young people were grumbling, and I told them, you're going to remember that you worked with the great Izzy Stone. It's going to be one of the high points of your life. Don't complain about it. And then the phone rang, and it was Izzy. And Izzy said, listen, I'm an old war horse. I can't help myself. I go down to the building, the press building in Washington, to look at the wire services after I write something, and I'm not going to change my ways. We better not do this the way I suggested it. It's not going to work. Why don't I just send you pieces when I have something I want to say? And we agreed, and that was my experience working with Izzy in that way. And before that, the way I had gotten to know him was that when I came to the nation, we decided we wanted to have a conference in partnership with a magazine in the Netherlands to launch something we called Internation, which was an investigative journalists from all over the world would come together and exchange ideas and help each other think them through. And we would do it in Amsterdam, where the Vrij Nederlander, the publication was. And I thought to invite Izzy as the speaker, to give the keynote address. And I called him and he said he would be thrilled to do it. And because he and Esther had actually taken their honeymoon in Amsterdam, and we had arranged a low-budget deal with an airline so everyone could come over for just a few $100s that we would pay their way. We had no fees to pay anybody to speak. And Izzy accepted the invitation, and then he said, oh, by the way, that when he went overseas, he and Esther liked to travel on the Queen Elizabeth II. So, okay, it was worth it for us, for Izzy to go on the QE2, but it turned out the QE2 got in 3 days in advance of the conference, and Izzy said, that's fine, at my age, I need to get my land legs going again, and we have a little place in London, and we like to stay for a few days. We got there, so they stayed at this place in London, and he said, and by the way, we took our honeymoon in a little cottage on the canal in Venice, and if you could find that cottage, it would be great. We found the cottage, and Esther was there, and it may have been Celia was there too. One of his children, he told me, was going to come and visit them there. They came too. And then it became obvious to him, Hamfish, my partner, was grumbling about all the money this was going to cost us, which we didn't have to spend. And then Izzy said, listen, you know, the last time I was in Amsterdam, some years ago, I spoke to some church. You should call them and tell them I'm coming, and I think they'll have me speak. They'll give me a big fee, and I will dedicate it to the Internation project, and you won't have to worry about the money. And that's what we did. He took no fee, and it was a great thing for everybody. So I had this experience with him. You know, he was living in one city and I in the other. I wasn't that close a friend of the kind you're describing, but I did get to know him that way, and it meant a lot to me. And it meant enough to him so that when he knew he was dying, I assume I was one of this whole series of people he had known throughout his life. But one day the phone rang, and it was Izzy who called, and he called to say goodbye. And he called to say thank you for our friendship. And no call I ever received meant more to me than that. So I am very honored to be here and get this medal. It's the highest thing the best thing that could happen to me. That's all I have to say, other than that Izzy said when I talked to him about this, I'm sure I'm not the only people he said that to after the thing in Amsterdam. He said, look, I'm having so much fun I ought to be arrested. So that's what I'll always remember about him. Anyway, thank you very much.